Thank you, Leon, and thank you everybody for coming. You've had lots and lots of propaganda from various political parties about 20 years of freedom and what's been delivered and what hasn't been delivered since 1994. This is not another one of those. The fact of the matter is that we're changing all the time. We're changing quite dramatically as a society. And what I want to do this evening is to give you snapshots of what that means. And this really comes from a project that I was very fortunate to get, and it was from the Citizen newspaper. Martin Williams, who was the then editor, is here with us this evening. And effectively what the Citizen chose to do was something I haven't seen any of our newspapers do before, and that was to run a series of articles, one a week, on long-term trends of change in society, rather than looking at what's happening in the news, rather than looking at what politicians are particularly claiming or whatever. So they wanted a background thing. We thought we'd run that for 12 weeks, get a sense of what's going on. Well, 12 weeks happened, and we needed to do more, and it carried on, in fact, for 18 months. And off of that, of course, is a lot of data and research that came through and trends identified. None of it is original research. We were pulling stuff together that other people have done. A lot of it comes from things like the South African Institute of Race Relations annual survey, stuff from Stats SA and various other places. But what I want to do this evening, and it's partly been influenced by months and months of really election campaigning, etc., where we've kind of lost, I think, some of the overall sense of how society is changing from the ground up. Now, a lot of change that happens, you can't really tell who's responsible for it, because that is the nature of how human society operates. That is the nature of us being a collection of millions and millions of individuals who act in their own self-interest. But we do in a country which has a huge argument culture. Not unlike American politics, we tend to say this is the ANC's fault or this is the ANC's achievement, as though politics is everything and everything is politics. But in actual fact, a lot of what happens in societal change we cannot predict. When you are not sitting in a situation of extreme political governance, and we're not, then much of the change that happens willy-nilly. And so I refer you back to a book that I think politically was the most, or seminal for me. It was the most influential on the way I looked at the world. It was published in 1990 by the Institute of Race Relations. John Cain Berman was the author. It was called South Africa's Silent Revolution. What that book did, to my mind uniquely, was, and it was coming out soon after F.W. de Klerk's reforms of 2 February 1990, and it was saying that in actual fact, these reforms were not the consequence of some road to Damascus. They were not the consequence of the armed struggle. They were not the consequence of sanctions. These were the consequence of a long period of people on the ground, ordinary black folk, causing the change to happen, collapsing the apartheid state by acting out of their economic self-interest, integrating into the workplaces of urban areas right against what the ideology wanted, integrating in residential areas, doing a whole bunch of things that made apartheid simply a nonsense. But it was not because the social engineers had come to see some big light at the end of a tunnel. No, it was because they were catching up with ordinary folk. So what I hope to do this evening is to, well, firstly we understand the silent revolution doesn't stop because a book was published, it carries on. But what I want to do this evening is to speak to some of the change that has happened for ordinary folk, particularly for black people, and by black I mean African, colored, Indian, and where possible I've broken that down, because off of that is going to be the major set of drivers for change in our society in the decades to come. But we can't predict what the change will be. So if you're looking for a set of answers and an all-in-one kind of presentation that tells you where we're headed, I can't do that. But what I can do, hopefully, is with these snapshots, give you a sense of where we've been going. And I call it just being real. So yes, it is true that we need to look at policies that come out, we need to look at politicians, but it's not all about them. And really, when people have greater opportunity because they've either got more money or they have better education or they're living longer, whatever it is, off of that will come more of the silent revolution that every society has. But I did mention in the invitation that we're going to talk about inequality because I kind of want to knock this thing out the way. There has been a big angst in our press recently about so-called inequality. I say so-called because inequality is morally neutral. The fact that some people have some things and others have less of it is not in and of itself a good or bad thing. It may be a sign of stagnation or of progress. You want a real equality, you go to North Korea. But nobody assumes that North Korea is a better place to be than we are here with much higher inequality. Inequality is often a sign of progress. So there's been this book by a Frenchman called Thomas Piketty. I haven't read the book, which is what started this whole global discussion that capitalism has been the cause, he says, of great inequality, which really starts, I think he measures it from the early 70s. Some will tell you when Nixon goes off the gold standard, but that's another story. But in South Africa, the debate has been taken up particularly by the head of WITS, Professor Adam Habib, who wrote a big piece in the Sunday Times. The pivot on which the piece rests is that for every year since 1994, inequality has increased in South Africa, and we've become the world's most unequal society. He's wrong. He's wrong because he says that is based on a thing called the Gini coefficient, and that is a mark given where 0 is a country where everybody has the same, kind of a North Korea, and 1 is where one person has everything. So that would be total inequality, and in between is your mark. Well, the fact is that in South Africa in 1994 we had a mark, and there it is, or 1996, you can see it's 0.53. It went up, and it has come down. But within black society, within Africans in particular, within that Gini coefficient, the increase in inequality has been quite big. Well, you'd expect that, because it is a sign that a whole bunch of African society has improved its position. So whereas perhaps in 1996, most of black society was, you could say, North Korea, now you've got North Korea and South Korea. You've got a middle class, and a big one, of millions and millions of people having increased. So it's actually a good sign that there's been that progress. That's what you would expect to happen. I'm not saying that obscene inequality isn't a thing to worry about, because people will look at things, they will look at their relative deprivation. This will concern them, this might create social unrest. It's never a good sign anyway. There doesn't seem to be a justice in it, in all the outcomes being like that. But the critical thing is that it's a moving target. And that for us, firstly, it's not true that it's always gone in one direction. And secondly, it's not true that it's necessarily a bad thing. We just don't know. But mostly it looks like there's been progress, particularly amongst Africans. The worst in the world stories are nonsense. I mean, the World Bank only gives a Gini coefficient to 40-odd countries. So of the 200-odd, most of them don't have a score at all. We don't actually know. Amongst the 40-odd, yes, we've got the worst one. I don't think that it justifies either Adam Habib's call for higher taxes on the rich, he doesn't define the rich, or the justification for that money to be withdrawn from the economy for purposes he doesn't state. Nor does it justify Business Day then coming out and saying that in fact inequality is a bigger problem than poverty. Well, that's not true. If you're all starving equally, that is a bigger problem than if I've got a Kia and you've got a Mercedes-Benz, because that is really the kind of difference we're talking about. Inequality in itself is not the issue. This is the only slide I will give you with lots of little writing, but because it's income, it is the most important thing in some ways about what chance people have, what opportunity they have to operate within themselves. And in constant rands, household income doubles from 96 to 2012. That has got to fuel silent revolution stuff over time. Personal income up almost 300%. That in constant rands is African disposable income. In 1996 and 2011, see what happens. It's an enormous change. 15% of Africans in the private sector were earning the same as the average white income just at the beginning of the century, which is 14 years ago. But by 2011, that had jumped from 15% to 40%, and according to calculations made by an outfit called Profit Analytics, that will have come to a complete, by 2020, 5.1 million. In other words, that the income inequality, racial, in the private sector will have disappeared in this decade. That is huge change when you think about where we're coming from and where people have found themselves. Already by 2013, 1.3 million black South Africans in the private sector were earning more than white people on average. Public sector pay is another issue. And on that, there's a little bit of a dodge that I'd like to point out that government uses. And that is that every year you'll see they normally talk about, well, we have a 6% increase in salary, and that's across the public sector. Sometimes you get a strike, like in 2011. But actually, that doesn't properly reflect how much pay has risen in the public sector, because the dodge is called promotions and regrading. And it happens on a big scale every year. And it is through that, and the wage bill that comes out of that, when you look at the wage bill, you see that actually public sector increases in salary are much bigger than the 6%. So that also has an effect on what you see at the top, household income W, that sort of a thing. Yeah, just to note that at the very bottom of the pile in South Africa, people living on US $2 a day, there were 16% in 1996, and that's down to 3% just 2 years ago. So people almost at a starvation level, much, much lower. Again, that means greater mobility. In possessions, because that's another measurement, so Gini coefficient only looks at consumed income. That's all. Doesn't look at whether you own things. So by the way, our great inequality doesn't include the fact that people receive houses or electricity or potable water or things like that. That is not included in the calculations of the World Bank on your inequality status. So in fact, we would never be quite as unequal as is being claimed, because they only look at income. But on living standards measures, and those are things that come out from the South African Advertising Research Foundation, that's where they cut the consumer market into 10 parts, and it's according to what you own. Do you have a washing machine? Do you have a car? Do you have a DVD player? That sort of a thing. LSM 1 would be people who own the least goods. LSM 10, people who have the most. And you just look at the progress there. The proportion of people at the lowest 3 living standards measures. And it is an enormous progress. And again, this is telling you a sort of a picture of a trend of how things are going. These are just basic circumstances that people find themselves in. Formal housing up 80%. That is not entirely through the state's housing program, but race relations figures show that in the housing program, from September 96 to end of 96 to 2006, you had 1,000 houses provided a day in the RDP program, and that made an average of 12.8 houses going up for every shack or hut that was erected. And if you look at the housing policy and the progress that those figures, if that's maintained, means that by 2032 you won't have any shacks or huts left. That is if the progress continues at 1,000 a day. That surely changes things too. Electricity, water, big changes. Of course, your fundamental right is that to live. And we have since, really through urbanization, which is the best contraceptive in the world, this is urbanization mainly that brings down your fertility rate, the amount of children that people have. And we're now at a point of, probably by this year, under 1% of population growth in South Africa. We're not even replacing ourselves if those figures have got to that point. But this is where it's been declining quite quickly from the beginning of the century to 1%. And the United Nations suggests that as a result, the 52 million we have now only goes to 56 million at mid-century and then drops back to 54 by the end of the century. So what we're looking at now in South Africa is what you have in terms of the total number of people. And again, off of that must mean a certain rising prosperity, because it's only that many people chasing that many opportunities. Because life expectancy dropped, and it dropped to 53 years, and that was a consequence of the lack of government policies on ARVs under the HIV/AIDS scourge epidemic pandemic. But it's back to 60 years, and it's rising. So we're living longer. And of course, we're dying less when we're very little. So almost 30% drop in infant mortality in the 20 years. In the two census, that is the one in 2001 and the one in 2011, we noticed that there's a youth bubble going through the population. So we were an average of 21 years old in 2001. Now we're 23 years old on average. So slowly we're aging. And we're going to get to a point, not soon, but in due course, of the European problem of an aging population having to be supported by fewer and fewer youngsters. That has other consequences. We've closed 10% of our public schools. 3,000 schools have been closed down, partly because of interprovincial migration, partly because there are fewer children in certain areas. And there we have. These things have got to speak. Malnutrition dropping 70%. Only last week it was pointed out that South Africa and Ghana are the only two countries in sub-Saharan Africa with at least 95% of people properly nourished. Now just remember where we're coming from. That is, firstly, it's big progress, but secondly, people who are properly nourished are people with far greater choices. Silent revolution stuff. I mentioned school feeding because there must be all sorts of reasons for nutrition improving. But I wonder how many people are aware that it is over 80% of our public schools now are providing a full hot meal every day. That's with a meat or a protein, 2 veg and a starch. That school feeding scheme has only been running at that extent for the last 2 years, but it is, according to Tiger Brands Foundation, they claim it is running to the extent that government claims. And those are obviously in your poorest schools, the bottom 3 quintiles, but it's more than 80% in terms of number of schools. That must have an effect. And I assume that social grants have an effect. You can put grants kind of anywhere. I've put them here. There are 16.5 million of them, which doesn't necessarily mean that there's 16.5 million people getting them, because some people get more than one grant. You might have a disability grant and 4 children grants or whatever it is. But
People get
and some people might get them, 16.5 million of them, and that's all well and good. And for a lot of people that must no doubt have been the difference between utter destitution and some way of moving up the ladder. But it costs money. And we cannot go on with an ever expanding welfare state forever. I mean, if you're fiscally prudent or conservative, then you must be happy that the ANC won. Because if you looked at the DA's proposals, which were a far greater expansion of the welfare net than the ANC is prepared to even countenance, then trust you me, you are happy that the ANC is in power and not the Democratic Alliance. Because this is what it costs. I mean, 40% of households think that their social grants are, well, tell you that the social grants are their main form of income. So that is a large part of the population utterly dependent. These things, once you have a large dependent class, don't disappear. Very difficult to roll back. Mike Schussler, the economist, claims that it's actually 70% of our budget on welfare, plus other ancillary things like housing provision, that sort of a thing. So that is where our money goes. At 15% equivalent of gross domestic product. And you can see the world average. So we've really pushed the limit. We are skating on thin ice, fiscally, when we have gone that far, and there's no sign that we plan to rein it in. Having said that, our state debt to GDP is not one of the world's sort of crisis situations. We're at 42%. The IMF reckons we could be at 47% quite soon. And if you look at some of the first world countries where their state debt to GDP is, we're not in a bad position. But markets, we're in an emerging market, and banks, creditors, rating agencies are not so kind to countries such as ours. We are not in a position where we can go that much higher on state debt to GDP. So really what I'm trying to say is that, and when you look at who's paying for it, we are really skating on thin ice. Because yes, Gavin Gordon brags about 14 million taxpayers, but only 2.8 million of them are paying 97% of personal income tax. So that is the golden goose that we have to be careful that we don't knock out the picture. Although I've mentioned here that there is 27% of state revenue for the national budget does come from VAT. So there is, which is of course something paid by everybody. So it's not only these 2.8 million paying, but they're very important. And the Free Market Foundation has pointed out that our top tax rates fell 10 percentage points, but a lot of countries over that period of time, from 1985, did better. I think it was 19 countries that were able to get ahead of us in terms of how many percentage points they dropped their top tax rates. But frankly, we had a surplus in 2006, and we're now into large deficits again. So we are literally at the end of that tether. We're not going to be reducing welfare payments, but we've got to hope that the uplift that I've been mentioning is going to have an effect on how people operate. I want to mention corruption briefly because it's a thing that we all worry about, and it's a thing spoken of with great angst. But the nature of corruption is you can't really tell how big it is. It's an insidious thing, it's under the table, it's crooked. That's the first problem with it, trying to work out how bad it is. And secondly, of course, that when we have law that perverts the market, we introduce corruption into the system. Whether it's we think a benign form of corruption becomes very difficult, and that can happen in tendering procedures, particularly race-based law and things like that. That's when it becomes very difficult to stop the system from automatically being a corruption. Having said that, the Public Service Commission reckons that they came up with 1 billion rand in state expenditure having been corrupt, which Edward Nathan Sonnensberg says it means the situation's out of control, but look what it really means. It's only 0.1% of state expenditure. That's not Nigeria. It's not Malawi.
Do you exclude arms expenditure there?
That's everything that is included in last year's PSC report. Transparency International perceptions. That's a perception rating South Africans have of their own corruption. Now, we have been falling down the list, but mainly because other countries have been doing better in their own perceptions. Our actual mark in the last 10 years has got better more often than it has got worse. In other words, oddly enough, given the public discourse, South Africans tend, over the last 10 years, to feel that corruption is lessening, as measured by Transparency International. I think the only two things you can really look at for our purposes are this one, because it's got a straight figure, and then the Auditor General's reports. How many of them are qualified? And the proportion of qualified reports that he's giving are falling. And look how much. National departments fallen by 10%, provincial departments 61%, municipalities 45%, and in public entities by 83%. Now Adrian Arnott sitting at the back, he's an auditor type fellow. He will know that that is improvement. And I've done something right. All right, then we've just got general growth. And the thing is that it seems to me that GDP versus population growth is the bottom line of everything. If you're outstripping your population growth with your economic growth, that's got to mean progress. It's got to mean a general rising per capita income. It's got to mean stuff that we didn't have for a long time, which is that we're getting richer. And we've had a muddle through growth since 1994, an average over 20 years of 3% a year. A 3% a year, despite what the National Development Plan tells us that it wants by 2030, despite what political parties insist that we need to mop up the unemployed, 3% a year, I would suggest get used to it. Because we haven't really done better than that. In only one decade did we have 3.6%, and that was through the 2000s. But if you look at the 20 years since 94, it's 3%. But 3% a year, as it accumulates, had per capita income up 1/3 in 20 years, which is a huge change. We have 4 million new formal jobs since 1994 in a situation of unemployment hovering, sticking around 35, 36%. So what does that mean? It means that we are creating jobs in the South African economy at the same time as we have rising joblessness. Quite simply, what it is we have a pool of unemployed people, and that pool is added to every year, even though the labor absorption rate, the ability to take in people, has improved. So we're getting new jobs, and that's not the job opportunities of government schemes, by the way. Those are actual jobs. But at the same time, we're increasing unemployment. It's a very, very funny situation. A lot of the people who are unemployed will remain so. And a lot of them, I guess, are unemployable. Just on ownership changes over this period. So this is the year where, for the first time, the banks can record that blacks have become the majority owners of private household property in South Africa. And that is a remarkable change if you consider the fact that in homeland areas you're not allowed to own private property. That a lot of people were stuck in townships where the state owned property and mostly still does, as far as I understand it. So a big change there, and that has been coming over some time. In 2011, Mike Schussler pointed out that the figure then was about 40-odd% of private home ownership was black. But he pointed out then that, according to his calculations, 32% of black people who owned private homes owned a second property. So the figure for whites was 1 in 10 homeowners owning a second property. This figure comes from the head of this foundation, Thembinala Chunga, and he's got a whole bunch of other figures as well, where he talks about African ownership of shares on the JSE rising 61% in 10 years. I don't know how these things are calculated. Very difficult thing to calculate, I would have thought, because even a pension fund owns lots of shares, and who owns the pension fund, etc. But nonetheless, Finmark Trust claims that 83% of small businesses are now formally owned by blacks, and that's broad black. And the Institute of Race Relations says that JSE black directorships in just 2 years to 2010 up by 83%. No doubt that being an effect of BEE legislation. And now we're finally mostly urbanized. The Gordon Institute of Business Science points out that if you take the greater Gauteng metropolis from Kuruleni to Pretoria to Johannesburg to the West Rand, it's one of the world's, just in terms of geographical size, one of the world's top 10, which is a thing of easier, more efficient provision of services to. Because when people are in closer proximity to each other, obviously they have more chances of interaction, and it's cheaper to provide them with various services or goods or consumer choices. Now, the Caxton newspaper group, you will know they're the guys that have the knock and drop newspaper. So they're very big on the local newspapers. You get the Sandton Chronicle, papers like that, Melville Times. They have a research outfit called the Newspaper Advertising Bureau. These are its figures for racial change, and I've just given you 5 examples that are examples that I think are not, they're not out of line with the other examples. I've got lots and lots and lots of them for the country. But they just give you a sense of how this is black middle class moving into suburbs in the last 5 years. Polokwane, from 30% to 64% of that area now with black residents. Midrand, 53 to 62%. Kempton Park, a third to a half. And so it goes. Even Durban's Pereira, from a third to just over a half. And this is replicated throughout South Africa. And it's just in 5 years. A very big move by the black middle class, which of course, as we've worked out, itself has expanded greatly. In fact, Gauteng has had its housing units double in just 18 years. So we built a city over 127 years and we doubled the thing in terms of housing units just in 18 years. A lot of that's your RDP housing, but not only. Not only. The problem that the University of the Witwatersrand points out is that people are being locked out of owning property in the new suburbs. So they say that the severe strain marker financially is when this happens, when your household income, when the price of the suburban house is 5 times your income, but they point out that in Gauteng the average is 22 times. So what they're saying is that effectively decade and decade and decade of declining to build housing in urban areas because of influx control and things like that is catching up with us in that the supply isn't matching the demand. And so people who are at, say, the nurse level, teacher, public servants at that level are unable effectively to do what you'd expect in a normal society, and that is to move into the suburbs. They're being locked into the townships. That won't last forever. Again, the market will react. But that is the current situation. So it's not all roses. It's not just everything's going up. There are problems that are structural, such as the lack of suburban housing in South Africa. It's one thing to put up 1,000 RDP houses every day, but people who want to move into places like Dawn Park are finding themselves locked up. But at the same time, and this I bring in the unions because of the silent revolution stuff. For so long, our political debate in South Africa and the way we make deals is between elites, including the trade unions, because they're effectively the middle class at work, but not in the same way as they were. So the unions of Cyril Ramaphosa in the 1980s and the National Union of Mine Workers then, COSATU then, that was a mainly private sector operation. Now it's mainly a public sector operation. And that has a huge, and for their sake, detrimental effect on their effectiveness. Because not only is their membership down, but their members are in the wrong places. If you look at these 2 strike years, 2011, 5.4 million man days lost to the public service striking, no effect on GDP. Now, I'm not saying it has no effect on their clients or customers, or if it's teachers on strike, it has no effect on school kids, it does. But this is where your unions would be more potent, which is in the private sector, where the same sort of number of days lost last year did have an effect on GDP. And I mean, just as a result of that, it seems to me an absolute dereliction of national leadership that a strike is allowed to continue for 16 weeks in the Platinum Belt and put the entire Greater Rustenburg at risk when it gets referred to the CCMA, these places like that. That's a situation where you need national intervention, because this is the real effect, and that strike in the Platinum Belt will affect us all. All right, now what I call AdCorp, Loan Sharp, the economist at AdCorp, just by looking at payroll returns, they reckon that 1/3 of people working in the private sector now are temps. So you can ban brokers all you like, but the fact is you can't actually stop an economy where 1/3 of the people working are temporary workers. That is how the nature of how we work has changed. That is no good for the unions either. Then there's these job opportunities. So you will have noticed the ANC was offering 6 million by 2020. And those are things like working for water, waving red flags at roadworks, The biggest of the projects is the expansion of the Durban port. But if the government imagines that people being given those temporary, unskilled, low-paying jobs are going to be let off when those projects come to an end, then it's got another thing coming. You do not hire 6 million people over the next 8 years and then tell them they're let off. Those people will increasingly have to, well, they'll just have to continue to be hired. You cannot put up big job creation schemes and then stop it with nothing in its place. And when that happens, that undermines your union position, your central bargaining, all of those things that this foundation is rightly challenging. So what I'm really trying to say is that in the change happening, it's all working against these fellows, which really probably means, in ways we can't predict, that there will be new centers of power or new power dynamics in how we negotiate working conditions and how people organize themselves to the extent that they can. This is what's part of what's happened for South Africa's black African majority in the 20 years. The number employed up double. That is, again, part of the problem lies with you had a huge unemployed and unemployable pool too, but people are no longer as dependent as they might maybe once were, and will become less dependent on things like the grants. Then you have the effects of things like affirmative action, black economic empowerment, where management, the hue of management, and indeed of ownership of companies is changing too. But it's a very difficult thing to properly measure, and it's impossible to measure things like its cost. But then there are other things of mobility. Car ownership, up 120%. People can talk on telephones, 223% up, and in a very short period of time. And then, of course, the business ownership I've already mentioned. And that's the Achilles heel that everybody will almost automatically point to, and that is the public schooling system. I really just want to, the first 3 points are really to just mention how difficult, we've got to be real here, how difficult it was after 1994 when you're taking 17 education departments, many of them marching to their own drum, very often with completely different types of per capita budget on the children. You meld them into one thing with the first new syllabus in 30 years, and you have compulsory schooling. You've seen some of the results. Well, let me just point to a couple of things that you might not know. One of them is, again, it comes from WITS, that the dropout rate, in other words, the lack of throughput, people dropping out in what we call grade 10, we used to call standard 8, is equal to the similar dropout rate in the United Kingdom. 45%. Equal or very similar. The other thing that you will often hear is that our maths and science student marks are the worst in the world, coming 142 and 144 out of 144 countries. That is true. What you're not often told is that it's not the only class that's marked. There are 2 other grades marked each time. And it's in grades 3 and 6 that we have shown dramatic improvements in those 2 subject areas. So what I'm really trying to say is that it might not be a thing where you can hope for very much out of the current crop coming out of matric as much as you would hope in time, which is why there's a 2025 plan on trying to get them there, and whether that works or not, it's a question of putting our hopes in the younger kids. But the fact of the matter is that no serious educationist questions the honesty of our matric marking or the Umaluzi Oversight Board, and nobody can seriously question the difficulty of matric exam papers. And if you do, I would suggest you go to the Department of Basic Education's website where you get papers that you can write. You will find them really difficult. Mind you, I did Transvaal Education Department, but I think some people did IEB by discipline. On infrastructure, and as you know, through my work with Anglo, De Beers and Nedbank over many years, I spent a lot of time on our rural schools infrastructure projects. This, I can just tell you, is a very good sign of where we, if you just see here, those are the shortfalls now in public schooling. Toilets 4% don't have, water 9%, electricity 14%. Seems like a lot. It isn't. Compared to a system that had to pull in the schools under trees, which have virtually disappeared now, the homeland schools, etc. Public schools, believe it or not, are improving. Not all of them, but in the main. And if we accept matric results when they go down, we must accept them when they go up. It's the same system. So in other words, we have in our national debate a kind of a thing where we say, oh, the results have gone down. That shows the standards have fallen. Oh, the results have gone up. That shows the standards have fallen. Oh, you've got to make up your mind. You can't have it both ways. And I would suggest that for a lot of our public schools, things are slowly turning the corner. Tertiary education, we've doubled the number of graduates in 20 years. We've also built the first universities since, or campuses in Kimberley and Nelspruit since 1982. There's a whole bunch of stuff we couldn't do for 30 years for lack of cash. Railway stock, rolling stock, now the world's biggest procurement program on that. But the fact is that we didn't build anything since the University of Venda in 1982, but the student numbers have gone up dramatically. The state loan system, which the DA would give to everybody, needing it or not, but at the moment is restricted to people who need it, is already providing loans, not full, normally it's not full cover, but it's part cover, to 115,000 out of the 170,000 youngsters in tertiary. Now the way that thing works is also quite interesting, because the system cannot run, it's too complex to run it from one place, and instead the monies are given out to the tertiary institutions to run as they will. And a 5-year study by Professor Safas van den Berg at the University of Stellenbosch Bureau for Economic Research had some quite amazing findings about how the loan system has worked. Well, firstly, the universities and technikons have not in the main been granting the loans to people based on academic ability. Almost entirely it has simply been on financial need. So once you kind of qualified to be, I suppose, what we'd call university entrance, then it was simply on academic need. But he finds that the loan students, despite that, perform on average better than those who are either being paid through families, privately financed, or financed through the banks, on bank loans. Don't know what to make of that, but that's just an interesting point I'd mention. This is where things are not looking good at all, and that is in the state of the South African family. South African families are just not holding it together. Marriages are down, divorces have become so easy that in fact now the courts do not wish to hear reasons for a divorce, nor can you contest it. So it's become the easiest contract to break, and one of the results is that divorces are up hugely, and only 28% of African children are living with both parents. That has got to have negative effects right through people's lives, and of course their education and everything else. Teenage pregnancy is up, although their childbirths are down because abortions are up. But teenage pregnancies and abortions very easily to get, and the big fights between the Departments of Health, which wants to provide condoms in schools to children from 12 years old up, and the Department of Education that won't let them on the premises. So there are big battles within government, even about things like that. Child-headed households though, so your orphan-headed households are down a third. Oh, not quite a third, sorry, down a quarter from 2002 to 2010, and that's partly because of the receding of the AIDS problem that we were having. And then there's the youth. The Institute of Race Relations tells us, and that's part of that youth bubble moving through that I mentioned earlier, that people under the age of 14 will have dropped by 21% as a proportion of the population just by 2040. So literally we will be aging. We might even notice it in our lives. There are two companies whose stuff I've used, Mina Nawe and Youth Dynamics. They are market research companies that focus specifically on urban youth, their buying patterns, their brand loyalties, their views on life, their values, how they see the world, how they see South Africa in globalized positions, etc. Generally, highly optimistic. Sometimes, perhaps unrealistically so, but that's also a function, I'm sure, of being young. Very globalized. Very few hang-ups about race. You know, in my generation, I'm almost 50 years old, and I still don't see very often people of mixed race in couples in my age group. But in 20 years younger, you see it all over the place. 69% of them want to plan, and this is an interesting lot. 62% don't imagine they'll get formal jobs, but they don't seem very upset by it. It's as though that's fine, they'll be running their own operations. Whether that's realistic or not, whether that brings disillusion and other negative consequences, I can't tell you, but that's just how they see it. Highly, if you worry about materialism being a god, and if you worry about a lack of spirituality, then you'll worry about this. But 85% of them do make a ball out of money, that money would make them happy. And then this is the last little bit I'll give you. Again, it's just to show you a sort of a trend. There was a transport policy document that came out in 1998 to look at the whole of how society was doing, called Moving SA. And that recorded 12% of South African adults as what they called stranded. And by stranded, they meant these are people who didn't have a bicycle, nor could they afford the cheapest taxi fare. They could see, they lived within their line of sight, to the horizon and back and no further. That percent is now gone. 12%. 12%, that to me was one of the most horrific things. And I read it at the time, and I just thought, goodness gracious, imagine. The horizon is the entire extent of possibility. Well, that's gone. That's silent revolution stuff, because that will have an effect too. People are now more mobile. They, for one thing, can talk on cell phones. The regular internet access is a function of telephony. It's a function of smartphones. But 43% of people now have it and use regularly. What regularly means, I'm not entirely sure. But again, a lot of it coming through technology, again, not through government program, but through technology, and then how people will react off of that, I don't know. But I'm hoping that it's something that we would look to. When we look at how society is changing, we don't only look at policy and law, we look at what ordinary folk are doing. Thank you.